So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kyle Mays, who's an Afro-Indigenous writer and scholar of U.S. history. He's Saginaw, Chippewa. He works in urban studies, race relations, and contemporary popular culture. He's an assistant professor of African American studies, American Indian studies, and history at UCLA. He's the author of Hiphop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America, and most recently, his book, which I think he'll tell us a little bit about, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Mays, and we'll open up for questions after this discussion. So go ahead, Kyle.
Thank you, Dr. Key, for the introduction. It's good to virtually see everyone. And thank you for even attending. I know Fridays and there's always a lot of things that people can be doing. So I really appreciate it, audience. I'm just going to briefly go over my approach to the work that I do, and the work that I have done, and what I'm planning to do in the future. So, and also give just a brief personal background as I go forward so you can get to know me just a little bit better. Also, I have a dog and a cat. Hopefully they're chill. My cat is snoring in the other room, but he might just pop up. So I apologize for that in advance, but hopefully we're used to the intrusions of our fur children. So as a general point, the questions that fundamentally guide my work are really centered on these three. What is the relationship between Black and Indigenous histories and cultures and peoples? Initially, it's something for me that began in the US as an extension of self, but as I'm going forward in this research, and I'll mention this later, it is certainly going way more global and diasporic, I think, as I go further along. The second question that informs my research in general: how can we build better solidarity between Black and Indigenous, and also for me, Latinx groups, poor people, and other oppressed peoples, even acknowledging that we live in a settler society. Right. So, in other words, what is our collective responsibility to each other within the context of a settler, colonial, and white supremacist society? And so I'm thinking of folks who are also forced to flee to the US because of the United States' neoliberal policies. So something like the war on drugs in the late 70s and the 80s, so-called war on drugs, and the terror that caused for folks from Central and South America and forced to come here. And finally, how do we prepare for a future in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? And I always forefront this question because I think it's important. And as Nina Simone once said, she was asked, "What is freedom?" And she thought about it and paused and said, "Freedom is no fear." And I think in general, Black and Indigenous and other oppressed folks, in the aftermath of these oppressive systems we currently live in, would be able to be their full human selves. And I think, hopefully that would be a goal that many of you also share. So the personal. So as mentioned, I'm Afro-Indigenous or Saginaw Chippewa, a tribe in Michigan, about 2.5 hours northwest of Detroit, and about an hour north from Lansing, Michigan, the capital. And so my great grandmother, Esther Chabus, or Keanoquayos, her indigenous name, she came to Detroit in the spring of 1940. Shortly thereafter, and she was about 16. Shortly thereafter, she married an African-American male. She got a lot of shit for doing that. This is the 40s. And it wasn't just, people, it wasn't white people in particular. It was Native men, and especially, who were very upset that this Native woman married a Black man. It's something that she dealt with throughout her life as an activist in the city of Detroit. And of course, they produced 9 Afro-Indigenous children. Many of them began to work in nonprofits, and education, which is something my great grandmother was very passionate about. And she became a well respected elder within the community. And of course, this culminated in the formation of, in 1984, what was called the Medicine Bear American Indian Academy, which was the third ever public school in US history designed with the indigenous curriculum. So 1980s and 1990s Detroit, it's a predominantly Black city, urban blight, rampant poverty, violence, of course, caused by poverty, deindustrialization, the whole 9 yards. But with the connection between Black and Native activism in the city of Detroit, and also the Afrocentric educational movement, which had been has longer roots in the city of Detroit, going back to the late 1930s with the Nation of Islam schools, and then culminating in a wave of Afrocentric schools that emerged in the late 80s and early 90s in Detroit. And connected to that, you have the emergence and strong support by the Black community and politicians to support the creation of the Medicine Bear American Indian Academy, which my Aunt Judy founded. So, at least on my dad's side, these are the people that I come from. And my mom is African American from Cleveland, Ohio. Shout out to Cleveland and shout out to Lake Erie. Still have family in both of these areas, although many of my family from Detroit have since moved back to the reservation or live in sort of surrounding small suburbs in the city of Detroit. So my first book, Hiphop Beats, Indigenous Rhyme, Modernity, and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America, published in 2018, was really an excuse to talk about Black and Indigenous relationships within cultural studies. So, although I'm a trained historian, I do consider myself a scholar of Black and Indigenous cultural studies. And I was exploring these relationships, how Indigenous people produce modern identities, aesthetics, and ways of knowing through hip hop culture. And that's why I decided to write that book. And so, which had nothing to do with my dissertation research. So I would highly advise not to do that if there are any grad students in the room. And so my second book, which just came out on November 16th of this month. And so I'm really making 2 points. Indigenous dispossession and African enslavement are the basis of how we should understand and explain US democracy. And settler colonialism and anti-Blackness continue to shape the lives of Black and Indigenous peoples. And I'm sure many of you saw even today the Kyle Rittenhouse decision, which I wasn't surprised. And, it's never fun, but I wasn't surprised. And this is how colonialism and white supremacy works, when you can cross state lines and shoot people. So we'll get into that, of course, but these are some of the things I try to document within this book. And it was a challenge covering like 400 years because you only get around 85,000 words, but I hope at least I did a good job. So my second book, which is coming out in May of 2022, is based on my dissertation research. And it's called City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit. And the key argument here is that urban dispossession is a key site to understand Black and Indigenous relationships. So just like this Afro-Indigenous history, I think there's some Indigenous scholars Indigenous studies scholars who argue, following the work of Vine Deloria Jr. If you ever read Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, published in 1969, he has a chapter on the red and the Black. And he essentially says, Black people have been fighting for civil rights and Native people have been fighting for treaty rights, which in a general sense, at least mainstream civil rights, there goes my cat, mainstream civil rights is generally true. But there are a lot of Black radicals who worked in solidarity with Native peoples, whether that's Angela Davis, whether that's Stokely Carmichael, and a host of other folks who understood that this is Indigenous people's land and Black people should be in good relations and solidarity with them based on that particular premise. And Detroit is an important case study to explore these relationships because for decades now, Detroit has been per capita the largest Black city. And within popular lore, we can talk about the bankruptcy of Detroit that happened in July 2013. Deindustrialization is sort of the epitome of modernity in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, in the early part of the 20th century, with the creation of the Oldsmobile, General Motors, Ford, etc. But they also, one of their key cars was the Pontiac brand, named after the Odawa war chief Pontiac, who tried to take over the Fort Detroit in 1763. In other words, indigeneity, ideas of nativeness, Native peoples' histories have also been a fundamental part of the creation of Detroit's cultural and modern identity and aesthetic. So this whole notion of urban development is deeply tied to not only the physical removal and dispossession of Indigenous peoples, but also the meta narratives that have been created to erase them from education, from popular culture, etc. Thus, indigeneity is a key analytic in understanding modern urban development. And these are at least the three core arguments that I try to make within this particular book. And the time period I'm covering is the late 19th century. It's sort of stopping at a particular moment around the bankruptcy. Current and future projects, I feel like I'm always doing something. So for all my senior colleagues, please let me know if I'm doing too much. I'm co-editing a special issue on global indigenous urbanisms that will be coming out shortly within the next few months. Co-writing a book on rethinking the Red Power movement, and I'm planning to do a book on how Black celebrity activism can undermine social movements. And as I mentioned earlier, the relationship between Black indigeneity as an analytic and the African diaspora. And what I mean by Black indigeneity, it can take a variety of contexts: how people of African descent produce some forms of indigenous identities, whether it's in the Americas or on the continent, and how it can either be a form of solidarity with indigenous peoples depending on where they're at in the diaspora, or a source of conflict. I'm still fleshing that particular thing out, but that's currently where I'm at as far as my current and future projects. So I'll stop there. I think that's a good time to stop. And thank you for listening to the probably 13-minute rant or so.
Thank you, Kyle. That was really sort of an amazing range of projects. And so, yes, it's a lot. And so, again, sort of a round of applause for Kyle's presentation, Dr. May's presentation. So, I'll jump into a couple of things. And then again, for the rest of the group, I invite you all to raise your hand and ask questions as well. But I think what would be interesting, I think, is for you to sort of tell us how you went on this journey of this research. I mean, I see the connections that you're making here, why Detroit and why Afro-Indigenous history and the work you're doing. But how did you, so this is prolific and it's fantastic, the content and the work that you're putting out. But how does one sort of take this on and piece these together in your workflow? How did you again, because as you said, and I think it's interesting for us to hear just from a learning perspective, you actually didn't pursue your dissertation work first. You actually pursued two other things and then sort of let that sort of, yeah. So explain, did you leave it on the back burner? Did you add it to or did you do these in parallel? What was that process?
Well, I was fortunate enough to get a 2-year postdoc at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of History. And I think I'm safe to say this now. They were very upset that I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna get to the Detroit book. Like, don't worry, it's going to come out. I have a whole plan of what I'm going to do. I'm not teaching, and I can be very focused." And someone prominent in the department told me that um, people who work on two book projects don't finish either one of them. I was like, okay, well, I guess we're gonna see if that's true. I'm not very competitive until you tell me I can't do something. So I decided I was like, I'm going to do this hip hop book to give myself a breather since I have 2 years away from doing the Detroit stuff. So I kind of a second to think about it, recalibrate, do some more research. But for me, the writing cannot stop, and it wouldn't make sense to do that. And I had been thinking about this project the last um, really my I guess beginning of my second year of graduate school. So I started in 2010 to 2011 and 12. I just started like, there isn't really much out there. And I was like, well, I can do that in the first year. And then the second year, while that was like under review and doing revisions, and I could go back to the Detroit book and think about how do I want to understand and recalibrate and do this Detroit project from the dissertation to a book. And it ended up being a longer journey. Um, I initially just wanted to do an indigenous sort of history of Detroit because Detroit is all about African Americans. And if one read my dissertation, there are African American stories and histories in there, but it's less prominent. And I did that purposely for the simple fact I was like, we need to know more about indigenous Detroit. And if someone wants to do a totally indigenous Detroit book, I'm down and I will support you. But talking with editors, mentors, and if there are any grad students here, those little questions and nuggets that your dissertation committee might ask you could be relevant later on. Because I was like, no way am I bringing African Americans into this. More so, it's more work. But I think by the time people get to it, it'll certainly be worth it. So we can better understand these relationships within urban studies and urban history, because most of the urban Native histories are focused on Native people, which is great, fantastic, because they've been erased from urban studies. But in a place like Detroit, it's just difficult to do given that it's predominantly Black space. And even what I learned from doing the Indigenous hip hop book was a lot of those rappers hang around, work with, collaborate with Black people in urban contexts all the time. And so it helped me see, oh, this is why this is really important. In addition to those annoying questions your dissertation committee might ask you earlier.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think that the insights can spur movements in different directions and enrich what is solid to begin with. So tell us a little bit more about sort of the right the overview of sort of this walking these in multiple worlds or what have you. I don't know what the right term is. And doing this kind of research, especially in a time, the current era that we're in, with regard to, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. I think in many ways, sort of I don't know that we're reckoning with it because I don't know that the country is reckoning with it. I don't know. The country somehow knows it exists. I don't know if reckoning is the right word because that suggests like atoning, but I don't know if we're there. But like, right, these issues with, again, sort of African Americans in the U.S. and indigenous peoples in the U.S. And so undertaking these projects, right, not just this one, not even one of your projects, but multiple of your projects have, again, this flavor, this underlying sort of pursuit of examining the way in which these two populations, similar but different in sort of history, treatment, outcomes today. So how does taking this on what is that like? Again, especially in this moment when, right, we have things like the court case that just happened today, and we're going to find out about Ahmaud Arbery coming up shortly, and
Yeah.
sort of the era that we just lived in with the past president as well. So like, what is that as a researcher, as a a scholar, a faculty member, a community member? What does that mean for you, and how does that sort of guide your work or propel you?
Well, for me, it shows that solidarity between oppressed groups is important and essential, but it is difficult and can be nearly impossible to achieve if we don't understand history, find historical examples, and at least in the US context and certainly other contexts, bring settler colonialism, or at least the question of land, to the fore, right? In any forms of, I think someone who understood this was Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. He was one of the few Black radical activists who explicitly said, "This is not my land. I'm not committed to reforming the US Democratic Project in a particular way. And I believe that land should be returned to indigenous peoples." And from that basis, how can you continue in a form of activism that excludes indigenous peoples? And in this moment, and again, that's not dismissing the issues that Black people face. That's not erasing that, and that's not the point that I'm making. And I hope that that's clear to everyone. But I do think that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Not all of us. I don't know if I could actually do that. But for analytical purpose, I think centering those things, whether that's talking about migrant justice or whatever, centering indigenous peoples in a particular way, while not decentering different experiences, but centering land and one's relationship to it and the people who are the stewards of that land, can alter how we understand activism and solidarity today.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, I think that I think speaks a lot to the current historical moment, as well as this idea. I think what you're saying about sort of uh, without that history, without that knowledge, people are people are sort of ungrounded, and there's been a lack of this type of information, this type of research, as you're saying. Sort of there's a gap in our literature. There's a gap in our indigenous studies literature, in our American Indian studies literature in this regard. The connections, or the lack of connections, or the similarities, and similar impacts in different way, but also different
Yeah.
under settler colonialism. Yeah. Well, I have more questions, but I will hold off for a second and let the audience chime in. So if you have a question, I'd invite you to raise your hand, or unmute yourself and uh, ask a question of Dr. Mays. Anyone want to chime in? All right, I'll give you guys another second or so. If not, I'll continue on. So this idea, so I find also very fascinating this idea of thinking about African diaspora and Black indigeneity. So maybe give us a little bit more insight on that. So when you're talking indigeneity, are you also talking about sort of reproducing cultural and activities in sort of like in the U.S., but taking activities and traditions from the African continent? Is that some of the things that you talk
Yes.
about? And,
Mhm.
and are you? So I'll let you answer further, but let me add one more thing. Do you mean like sort of across the Americas as well, like North and
Yes.
South? And
So, I- so a question, like a historical question that is more analytical but historically based, is when did people of African descent lose their indigeneity? Now, if we understand indigeneity, I think often the way it's talked about today is one's relationship to place or land. And I think that is fundamental, right? But I think the second fundamental part is one's cultural connection. And what about those people who are displaced? Um, and so when I ask that question, it's not to erase indigenous peoples and the US's claim to land. What it is to say, if people become Black or African American, that sort of erases this longer history. I mean, and optimistically, historically speaking, we know that people of African descent did not just because of the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. And, you know, although there's a lot of scholarship on it, I still think it's difficult for many of us to understand, just like genocide here, like the horrors of something so traumatic. But with that, I don't think people simply lost their cultures, forms of their languages, spirituality, and it's been pretty well documented by 18th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century historians. And so what I'm interested in is also those moments, but also contemporary forms of cultural practices, reclamation, just like we've had, you know, native groups, native nations here reclaim languages in a particular way, especially in the Northeast is what I'm thinking about. How can Black people reclaim connections to spiritual practices, ways of being and knowing without displacing and reproducing even forms of colonialism, which has happened historically on the African continent, right? And it's a question I'm trying to explore and get at now. And finally, although we consider the African continent sort of intact often, there are I was at a talk on African feminism via Zoom last week, and I think the scholar, she was from Kenya, I believe, and she made a profound point, which isn't, it's not necessarily profound, but it was profound to me. And she said, well, there's also colonization prior to, um, depending on where you're at in the continent. So not just the European one, but there were folks just preceding European colonization that colonized and displaced us. And it wasn't to say, therefore, all colonization is bad, right? But it was to say that there are these prior notions of indigeneity and colonization. They may not have called it that, of course, but that we have to kind of be attuned to as well, and reckoning, to use that term, with the past in order to project a present and a future.
Yeah, it sounds like it sounds very complicated, but very fascinating, especially in the Americas, where again, sort of a diaspora spread across a continent, the Caribbean, or sorry, multiple continents, the Caribbean, the islands, and multiple groups of settler colonial European countries, and it's fascinating, right? I think it's quite unique to think about it across those dimensions.
Like, into, sorry, Rainy, just to
Jump in.
make it even more concrete, I get the impetus for folks to compare, like, for instance, the civil rights movement in the US versus South Africa. But if we consider that South Africa a settler colony, and there's been a few scholars who have done this historically, but why not compare, or where's Africa within indigenous studies in the
Yeah,
US
right.
that includes the Pacific, but there's like a whole sort of continent of indigenous, etc., that exists. And I've always been curious as to why. I mean, you got the Nordic, the Sami people, which is fantastic. But it creates, I think, another important layer of conversation and comparison with South Africa and different settler colonies would be fascinating.
Yeah, that's what I think is the really unique part, that sort of right across hemispheres, across continents, across island groups, absolutely, and how they fit in, and how and where they fit in. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Okay, so I have more questions, but Jane Kinsey has her hand up. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, please go ahead, Jane. Thank you.
Kia ora. My name's Jane. I'm from New Zealand, and I'm here for a year at in LA at UCLA on a fellowship and learning so much. So thank you for having me today. It's amazing the work you're doing. The work I'm studying at the moment and what I'm really interested in is I guess the impact of historical trauma on adverse childhood, basically seeing it as an adverse childhood experience because of the intergenerational effects and the cumulative effects of adversity tend to kind of coalesce once you have one, and then of course all of the other social contexts that people live in sort of add to that. But there's quite a lot of work around, I guess, working through and getting better outcomes by having, access to services that are much more culturally appropriate and have, traditional knowledge and systems and services that give people, like you were saying, that sense of belonging and a place to feel safe and nurtured, I guess. So I'm really interested in how you can connect the history that you're doing and what you're finding is important to people with ACEs basically, and trying to understand how we can highlight that an ACE is historical trauma often for people if they have lost links or lost support or lost that belonging. So I was just interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I think in my research and studies on Indigenous hip hop, and you could probably insert other forms of cultural production, expressive culture, etc., especially for young Indigenous men in urban context. And it depends on the urban context too, right? So for many of them, it becomes some sort of way to enter into, going to ceremony or dealing with particular trauma, and they are rapping or doing graffiti or dancing, but then they get involved in community activism, doing things to better the self and the community. And I think for many of them, that sort of work helps heal them in a certain way. And not that they were just causing terror in their own communities, but they were missing something. And it then leads to them say, all right, well, I need to learn more about my culture to better myself. And I've seen this sort of countless times. One of the few rappers, one of the Detroit rappers that I know, Sacramento Knox, has been doing for years, like a very cool thing in Clark Park on the southwest side of the city, getting Black, because there's a lot of Latinx folks who live in Southwest Detroit. So getting Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks, youth in particular. So they just jam out, they have food, but creating spaces like that are one way to create healing and dealing with some of that trauma that many of them experience in the city, as one sort of concrete example. So they take a variety of different approaches in doing that. And then from there, I talk to people, they start going to ceremony, trying to do language revitalization things for the self and trying to teach youth at the same time. So I think expressive culture plays a pretty good role in helping construct those changes.
Yeah, I agree. I'd just like to see how that can be supported and scaled and those kind of initiatives.
Money.
Yeah, exactly. And so how can health systems as, I guess, anchor institutions in the community they live really support that and see that as a health service, I think would be good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, if those things are considered as a health crisis or issue, like the opioid stuff, which is a health crisis, but we didn't see that with the crack epidemic back in the day. I think we all know why that probably is, but it's not too late. and probably because I'm pessimistic today, but I don't see how they would value Black and Indigenous and Latinx folks within a white supremacist state in a certain way, and literally fund those things to better themselves. I don't see it.
I hope we do one day.
Right.
Some of us been awake, but you know.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the group? Somebody want to jump in? Well, in the absence of that right now, I have a follow-up question to some of the things I was asking you a little bit about, Kyle. One of the emerging sort of discussions going on is for African descendants of slavery in the U.S. is sort of this idea of reparations. And there's an economist at Duke University, Sandy Darity, who I know very well, who's actually just published a book last year, doing some of the calculations, doing some of, what that would look like and what that would really mean from a federal standpoint, addressing part of the wrongs. I don't think you could 100% do it. So tell me what your again, are you familiar with that sort of it's an emerging discussion. And I think actually, didn't somebody in the presidential debate actually mention this, which is, again, was a big, just rolled off the tongue. Maybe it was Kamala Harris or somebody, I can't remember who it was, Buttigieg or somebody. So it was, kind of elevating a discussion to another level. So in conjunction with obviously sort of, issues of land back and those sorts of situations. So tell us a little bit about sort of what you think and what you hear about those, again, policy, restitution, type activities.
Yeah, so I talk a little bit about this in the conclusion of an Afro-Indigenous history book. I think ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery, are anti-immigrant, both Black and Latinx immigrant, anti-Indigenous, but by omission, not really by like something that they said or have done. And I say that to say the whole idea of reparations is based on this notion that one of America's quote unquote original sins, or the original sin, was enslavement. Of course, enslavement was a fundamental part of the creation of the United States, right? The exploitation of people of African descent. But upon whose land were they being exploited? And so historian Claudio Sound has a book out on the financial and insurance and brokers, et cetera, of the people related to Indian removal in the 1820s and 1830s, right, from the South. And it was a whole point of speculation going on while dispossession is happening, similar to like the Civil War. While the Civil War is happening and Black people are fighting for their freedom, there's this whole thing of Western expansion that Abraham Lincoln is pursuing, and also committing forms of genocide against Native peoples and building railroads. So they had the power to do all that at the same time. So that whole notion of ADOT ignores that this nation is also built off of dispossession, and that dispossession is an ongoing issue well into the present. And when they erase that, and I've read the book, and I like the book. I don't have any issues with the book. Just as a project, but my fundamental question, or the Ta-Nehisi Coates' well-known article published in the Atlantic in 2014. Yes, I believe African Americans deserve some compensation, but do we really want it under capitalism, is a question. Two, can you really be compensated for the horrors of enslavement? And how do we have this conversation at the same time we talk about returning land to Indigenous peoples? And if that's not a part of the conversation of reparations, I'm not invested personally in having it. And I've heard it a million times in my life, whether in a barbershop or whatever. well, the Indians enslaved us meaning Black people. And I always stop them. Whoa, whoa, whoa. That was like 5 nations. That was an elite group of folks who decided to do that. And so that was not pervasive per se. And I mean, it's horrible. I'm not minimizing owning other human beings, but that wasn't all the indigenous tribal nations who are recognized and unrecognized by the state. So I try to dispel that myth with them because that is a I'm trying to think of the name of the book by Claude Anderson, and it has like last time I checked like thousands of likes on Amazon. And one of his key things is Native nations owe African Americans reparations, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense.
Oh, interesting.
Now those those nations who enslaved, I think there's
legitimate,
and
yeah.
I think maybe the Cherokee Nation is one of the only ones kind of trying to do something, sort of, not really.
Right.
The rest, they need to deal with that, but at least give them citizenship. But yeah, I oppose those sort of limited discussion.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to the research and the work that you do, this idea of sort of connections across these different groups, because right, these conversations are fundamental and not necessarily mutually exclusive, given where we are and what hasn't been resolved clearly over centuries of the United States being in existence. Yeah, that is. Yeah, I find the discussions incredibly interesting and yeah, also very useful because it's formalizing things that historically have not been formalized, whether the amounts are too big, too small, too soon, or even not. Like you're saying, in conversation with others, I find it useful as a start. But nevertheless, I agree with you in this idea of being in conversation across groups. But it seems like that's kind of your forte and your interest. What has been, so along those lines, unless anyone else has another question, what has been your reception? Oh, there is someone. Okay, I'll hold mine back. Kamel, Ann, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Camille Ann, I'm not a scholar, just a UCLA alum who's really interested in talking about this topic. And the question that I had for Dr. Mays is tying into this looking at indigeneity and Black diaspora in the Americas, and specifically about the Caribbean. You mentioned in speaking of Stokely Carmichael, the concept of that the land on which we inhabit here in America and in our activism for Black liberation, that is settled land and that is stolen land, and acknowledging wanting movement and progression without participating in that. And I'm curious as to if you expect in your scholarship or you've come across scholarship looking at that question in countries where they obtained either peacefully or violently or coercively through economic stripping, liberation from European colonialism, and the countries that are majority Black or Afro Asian populations, and that are, however, by function of derivative of colonialism, also occupying stolen land. And I thinking about it also in the context of I'm personally of a Jamaican specifically background, and as a kid, when you learn Jamaican history, there's a period of time where it starts with Columbus's arrival, and then you get a little older and you learn about the Taino and Arawak Native Indigenous peoples, and you learn that the Spanish killed them all and they're extinct. And then you get older, and there's this way in which there's history that's lost, and that all of these kind of, I think, complicate thinking about indigenous populations and thinking about places where they aren't even having conversations around land restoration, because the original purveyors of the theft, there was an obtaining of liberation from the, so I'm just curious, as a layperson, to what extent in your experience you've seen or have, or we will exploring that as part of looking at your future projects on diaspora, Black indigeneity, specifically in those kinds of, I guess, hybrid maybe countries?
Yeah, great question. And so I would point to 3 scholars who are actively doing this work now, and certainly much better than what I would be able to accomplish. Literary scholar Shona Jackson has a book called Creole Indigeneity that looks at how post-colonial societies in the Caribbean have perpetuated settler colonialism by erasing and accepting this narrative that indigenous peoples were completely wiped out and erasing them. And it's a fantastic book. There's a lot of Black folks that hate it. I don't mind it. I think you need strong opinions around this conversation to like move us forward in a very real sense. So that's one. One of my colleagues who is at Spelman, Shania Cordis, and has an article, I believe, in the UCLA's American Indian Culture and Research Journal as of maybe last fall or maybe in the spring. It came out recently on sort of this issue within where's she at? Garifuna, I think. And finally, my colleague Pablo, blank out his last name for whatever reason, and he's at Smith College, and he does work on Garifuna, but so in my understanding from his work, there was a slave ship of indigenous peoples, and they intermarried with the indigenous population there, and it became this sort of Afro-indigenous or Black indigenous population, and they still kind of celebrate this narrative today. And it seems like a unique particular place where we might say African indigeneity and we might say indigenous indigeneity for this purpose blended together, and it's still understood and celebrated well into the present as one particular example. So it is a fascinating thing, and I would hope education gets better down in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, Haiti as well, about where indigenous people's histories fit and persist well into the present today. Great question, though.
Thank you. And could you just repeat for me the name of the person that wrote the Creole Indigeneity book?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for your answer. I really appreciate that.
Are there other questions from other people? I don't want to take up all of our time. I've sort of been... So if there's not, I will jump in. Tell me what your reception has been. That was the question I was going to sort of get to. You're again sort of between different disciplines, different communities, writing research, conducting research into this sort of this limbo space, right? This space between groups where groups connect and where groups disconnect even. And so tell us a little bit about your reception from indigenous scholars or Black scholars, African American scholars in this work. How do people receive it? How do you navigate those waters? It's again, it's not, again, to my understanding back, this is novel research in all these different dimensions because it's not something that is undertaken in this way by many scholars. So how do you navigate this?
It can be a challenge early on, as a younger scholar, like just coming out. I think people are excited and showing you love in a certain way, especially indigenous scholars. And what I realized that for some of them, it was like, finally, we have a Black person who's Afro-Indigenous, like calling out all the Black scholars for their anti-Native erasure. And it took me a long time and I was like, whoa, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm actually trying to put these things in conversation to move forward.
Sure.
Not to say, see, this is the terrible things you all have been doing, which I'm okay with as long as you're trying to move the conversation forward. I remember I was at a conference at an Ivy League school a couple of years ago, and I kind of gave a similar talk of where are African within Indigenous studies. And a prominent scholar that I really admire came up to me afterward and said, well, they have their own Indigenous studies. Like, we don't necessarily need to include them in our understanding of Indigenous studies. And it's a curious take to me. I don't know what you lose by including Africa in conversations of indigeneity in the global north. Is kind of really what it's about to me. And sure, there's complications, but I think there's complications when you talk about, hell, indigenous peoples in the US and in different nations, or comparing, Native Hawaiians to and indigeneity to indigeneity here in the US, outside of the US empire, of course, connecting. So that's some of the reaction. And some Black folks are like, why are you doing this Native thing? I still get that sometimes, which I'm over. I don't really engage that question. Are you ashamed of being Black or stuff like that? And I was like, that wasn't an issue for me growing up.
Yeah.
You can be Black and Native. We had no issues with that. At least in my family and community. But
Fascinating.
so it's personally fascinating and intellectually creates a lot of curiosity.
Well, it seems like an area where there's like intellectually and academically, there's a lot of space there, and a lot of interventions that can happen, a lot of research interventions and that can be conducted. And it sounds like there's you're working on them, and that's fantastic. And I think you want to note a couple of the books you're mentioning again here. In the chat. Yeah, so your point, I think your point in that is that there's emerging literature as well now that's coming out in these areas.
Yeah, it's like right on the cusp of younger scholars in my generation are starting to really come out with that sort of work to push the conversation forward. So I'm excited and looking forward to it.
Yeah, fantastic. Any other questions? I'll leave space for anyone else to jump in. Well, if not, I want to thank Dr. Mays for being you are our third speaker in our series. Again, this is a series that's sponsored by American Indian Studies Center, American Indian Studies IDP, as well as the PISA, ASA, and EGSA, all these student groups, as well as UCLA Health, for it's in recognition of Native American Heritage Month. And please join us, all of you participants, on December 3rd, I believe it is. So not next week Friday, but the following Friday, we'll have Dr. Nanaba Garrison, who will be our fourth and final speaker of the month. And so with that, Kyle, Dr. Mays, we thank you for your time and enriching our world a little bit today.
Thank you, Ray, for hosting. I appreciate it. And thank you all for listening.
Good weekend, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.